Hello again, class. This time we're looking at Module 3, First Century Judaism. What was that world like? I want to read to you from the book of Acts, a case in which Paul was on trial before the Jewish council. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or angel spoke to him?" So we see that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as we indicated in the introductory lecture, are deeply divided, or were deeply divided on this issue. What did first century Judaism look like? This is going to cover in more detail a little bit some of the things we talked about in the introductory lecture. Well, what was Judaism's world? It was a world under Roman rule. Rome had conquered the Levant in about 115 to 116 BC. Israel and its Hasmonean rulers were conquered by Pompey in 63 BC, and Herod the Great came to power in 40 BC and ruled until 4 BC when he died. And after Herod died, we have the Herodian dynasty. Herod's sons and grandsons continued to rule portions of his kingdom well into the first century. We find, even in the book of Acts, we find references to some of Herod's grandchildren. So the Herodian dynasty persisted for quite some time. There were 3 procurators mentioned by name in the New Testament during this time period. Pilate, we're all familiar with Pilate. He was the one who was procurator of Judea at the time that Jesus was tried and crucified. Antonius Felix, we read about him in relation to the Apostle Paul, and also Porcius Festus. We read about him as well in relation to Paul. He was Felix's successor, and they had to deal with the case of whether or not to try Paul, whether or not to send him to Caesar, what were they going to do with him. So we know about these Roman rulers. So this is the political context of first century Judaism. By the 60s, revolt developed. In 64, there was a revolt against Roman rule. It was cruelly suppressed. By 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. By the end of the first century, early second century, the Bar Kokhba revolt sprung up, and this one was also suppressed, ended with the horrific suicides at Masada that we read about and hear about. Even a recent television show was made about Masada. And after the destruction of the Jewish people and the decimation following the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews were forbidden to live in the Holy Land by the Roman government. They were expelled completely from the Holy Land. So, Palestinian Judaism, what did it look like? Well, Judaism was a matter of Jewish identity. It was a matter of religion as much as it was a matter of ancestry. Jewish identity was closely tied to temple and temple worship and the sacrifices that went on in the temple. And we even see this in the early church. The Jerusalem believers continued to go to the temple. They continued to participate in temple ritual. Even Paul came and fulfilled a vow and offered a sacrifice, probably some sort of Nazirite vow perhaps, in the temple. And we're told about this in the book of Acts, and this was what was going on at the time that he was arrested in Jerusalem. The observance of the Sabbath was very important. The Old Testament prophets had criticized Israel greatly for its neglect of the Sabbath. And so the observance of the Sabbath became a huge issue in first century Judaism, and the elders developed hundreds of rules related to how to properly and correctly observe the Sabbath, right down to how far you could walk on a Sabbath day. And we see this in the New Testament. A Sabbath day's journey was a specified distance. The dietary laws, the kosher dietary laws, were a huge factor in Jewish identity. No pork, no fish that did not have both scales and fins. So no shellfish, no catfish, nothing like that. Circumcision, all the male children circumcised on the 8th day. If you were a Gentile and you wanted to convert to Judaism, you had to undergo ritual circumcision. The acceptance of the Torah as God's law was key. All religious parties accepted the Torah as key to understanding God's will for the nation. That being said, most of the Jews that lived in the Holy Land in the first century were not affiliated with any of the major religious parties. They were they were observant. They kept the dietary laws. They went to synagogue. They went to the temple, but they didn't identify themselves with one particular religious party. We have Judaism in the diaspora. The diaspora refers to the Jews as they are scattered throughout the Roman Empire. The diaspora stretched from Babylon in the east, which had a sizable Jewish population. Many Jews never left Babylon. They had settled in there after the Babylonian conquest. They built good lives. They built good homes. They had a good structure, and they were content to stay there. So we have Jews in Babylon in the east to the farthest reaches in the west of the Roman Empire. And Roman diaspora Jews spoke Greek. And a lot of times, especially in the book of Acts, in the context of temple worship, like in Acts chapter 2, when we read about people from different nations, probably these are Jews, diaspora Jews, who have come back to Jerusalem for the celebration of Pentecost. And that's why they're there. So we have the diaspora Jews who spoke Greek. They read the Hebrew scriptures from the Septuagint translation that we talked about in Module 1. Now, the interesting thing about the Septuagint is it came at some point, and I'm not sure when, but it came to contain the books of the Apocrypha, which were not included in the Hebrew canon, which Protestants do not accept as canonical. And even the apocryphal books themselves testify that the spirit of prophecy was no longer in practice in their day. And so there's good reason not to accept these books, but they came to be connected with the Septuagint because they were extant in the Greek language. So what were the forms of first century Judaism that we talked briefly about the other day? Well, we talked about the Sadducees. They accepted only the Torah and nothing else. That doesn't mean they didn't read the other books, but they didn't accept them as inspired the way they did the Torah. The Torah to them was God's written word given through Moses, and that's all that God had given. They rejected angels. They rejected any kind of afterlife. So when Jesus, for instance, deals with the question of the afterlife, he deals with it with the Sadducees from the Torah. They come to him with a question about marriage in the resurrection. And Jesus responds by quoting from the book of Exodus when God says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's quoting from the Torah. And then he says, God is not a God of the dead, he is a God of the living. Indicating that in some sense, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Moses' day were still alive in a non-corporeal form. So he answers them from the Torah because that's the authority they will accept. The Sadducees were confined primarily to the priestly caste, to the sons of Aaron and the family of Levi, the tribe of Levi, that were responsible for the temple and for the maintaining of Torah tradition. The Pharisees, on the other hand, accepted all of what we know today as the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible contains 22 books. Our English contains 39. It's the same books. It's how they're divided. The Hebrew Bible is divided into three principal parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the prophets begin with Judges and go through all of the prophets. There's the former prophets and the latter prophets. There's the scroll of the 12. The minor prophets are all in one scroll in the Torah. And so that's part of how they come up with 22 books. And Daniel is actually not included with the prophets. Daniel's included with the writings, with the wisdom literature. And so the arrangement of the books in the Hebrew Bible is different. Second Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew canon, which explains an enigmatic statement to us that Jesus makes about all the martyrs of the Old Testament period. And he ends with the last one killed in Second Chronicles. And we're going, well, wait, that's not the end of the Old Testament. Well, for Jewish believers, it was. Second Chronicles was the last book of the Old Testament. So the Pharisees accept all of that. They believed in a hierarchy of angels, and they believed in the resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. And these are teachings that you find in Job, you find them in Daniel, and in other places in the Old Testament, but you don't find specific reference to these kinds of things in the Torah. The Pharisees focused on a detailed study of the law, including, as your textbook points out, looking for loopholes, how to skirt the edges of the law without actually breaking the law. How far can we go before we've gone too far? Became a bit of the question of the day. And so this is kind of what lies behind the lawyer's question to Jesus: what must I do to have eternal life? It's this attitude of, how far can I go before I've gone too far? And I know we don't do that today. Surely we don't. Yes, we do. We all do that. How far can I go before I've gone too far? A lot of legal interpretation done by the Pharisees focused on loopholes in the law. Then we have the Essenes, which, as I've noted already, we don't really seem to encounter in the New Testament, unless some scholars would argue that John the Baptist perhaps had connections with the Essenes. We don't know. They lived mostly in separate communities. They kept strict practices of cleanliness, dietary laws. They were strict observers of the Torah, and they embraced almost all of the Old Testament as we know it today. The book of Esther is missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so as far as we know, they had no connection with the book of Esther. But their ascetic practices were very strict. They had very high eschatological expectations. They longed for the coming of the Son of Righteousness, who would set everything straight and make everything right again. They considered all other forms of Judaism to be corrupt. Everyone else was compromised in some way. The Sadducees were compromised with the Romans. The Pharisees were looking for loopholes. And then you have the unwashed masses, as it were. So they considered everybody else to be corrupt. They are possibly responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The debate about the relationship between the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls is ongoing, and I routinely get literature in my email from various archaeological journals that debate back and forth the relationship of the Essenes to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is an ongoing debate. We talked in Module 1 about the Zealots. The Zealots were political insurgents. They considered themselves holy warriors. They were nationalists, willing to assassinate Romans and Roman sympathizers if they got the chance. So, for instance, Barabbas, who was to be crucified and Jesus was crucified instead. Barabbas perhaps might have been a member of the Zealot party because he was involved, we're told, in an insurrection. So it's possible he was a zealot who had been captured and now was going to be made an example of by crucifixion. Then you have the masses. This is where most of the people in first century Judaism fell. They were everyday people just like you and me, just trying to live their lives, trying to get along, trying to do the best they can, and make the best of life. And life in the first century was harsh. Most people went without ever getting a full meal in a single day. So life was difficult. Wood had to be cut for fires, water had to be drawn for drinking and cooking and washing. They didn't have indoor plumbing and all of the niceties that we have. Life was hard, and you worked from sun up till sunset. They were just everyday people. They observed the basic Jewish practices. They observed temple worship, Sabbath, circumcision. They went to synagogue, all of these things, but they didn't identify themselves with any one particular religious group in Israel. So that's the Jewish people in the first century in a nutshell. Well, what were their messianic expectations? What were they looking for? What were they hoping for in a Messiah? And how does that relate to the coming of Jesus? Well, they hoped for a new Davidic king. They looked at David of the Old Testament as the model king. Much like in English literature, King Arthur is looked at as the model of the good king. They looked at David as the exemplar of what a king should be. And they knew, based on Old Testament writings, that someone descended from David would be the ultimate deliverer, who would reign upon David's throne forever. So in their mind, they're looking for a military conqueror, a military deliverer who will rise to the task of driving Rome out of the Holy Land, of regathering all of Israel back into the Holy Land, regathering the dispersion back into the Holy Land, purify the temple, make everything right, and restore the glory of the ancient Davidic kingdom. That's what they're looking for. That's their hope. They're not looking for Isaiah's suffering servant Messiah. That doesn't mean they didn't believe in a suffering servant Messiah. They did. They had a vision of two separate Messiahs, a Davidic Messiah and a priestly Messiah. And they weren't looking for the priestly Messiah. They wanted deliverance from Rome, and they were looking for the Davidic Messiah. And this is why Jesus, over and over again, doesn't openly identify himself with what the Jewish people expect in the way of a Messiah, because he has a mission to accomplish. And if he identifies himself with that Messiah, his mission will be cut short by the Romans. So they're hoping for a military political deliverer. That's what they want. They're also hoping for a restoration of the glory days. They are nostalgic for the glory days when David ruled upon the throne and the border extended from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River, and Israel was at peace in the land. They want Israelite independence. They want the recovery of all of their territory, which would include modern-day Syria, all the way down to somewhere in the Sinai Desert. There's a wadi, what's called the Wadi of Egypt. We now believe, rather than the Nile as the river of Egypt, we believe the Wadi of Egypt probably was the southern border. And to the east, it would include modern-day Jordan and those kinds of places. So this is what they wanted. They wanted the restoration of all Israelites back to the promised land, so that there would no longer be a dispersion. They wanted all these Israelites that were scattered from Babylon all the way to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire brought home, so they could live in their homeland again and have their nation like it was when David was king. This is a vision of first century Judaism. This is what they expected. This is what they wanted. And this is how they lived, and this is their circumstance. And we need to understand that as we open up and read the New Testament in order to know the historical context in which these first century Jews lived and in which Jesus and the early church ministered.